Good morning, everyone. Let me just start by welcoming our distinguished witnesses back to our subcommittee. Gail Smith, Coordinator for COVID-19 and Global Health Security at the Department of State. Jeremy Konyndyk, who's the Executive Director of USAID's Task Force on COVID-19. Leslie Zieman, Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Department of State's Bureau for Population, Refugees, and Migration. And Sarah Charles, Assistant to the Administrator in USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Affairs. We appreciate your time and your willingness to testify. Now, as this hearing is fully virtual, we must address a few housekeeping matters first. For today's meeting, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting yourselves. If I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you would like the staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. I remind all members and witnesses that the 5-minute clock still applies to the Q&A. If there is a tech issue, we will move to the next member until the issue is resolved, and you will retain the balance of your time. You will notice a clock on your screen that will show how much time is remaining. At 1 minute remaining, the clock will turn to yellow. At 30 seconds remaining, I may gently tap the gavel to remind members that their time is almost expired. When your time has expired, the clock will turn red and I will begin to recognize the next member. After the panel presents their testimony, we will follow the order of recognition set forth in the House rules, beginning with the chair and the ranking member or his designee. Then members present at that time and when the hearing is called to order will be recognized in order of seniority. And following that, members not present at the time the hearing is called to order. Finally, House rules require me to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members can send anything they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings or markups. That email address has been provided in advance to your staff. Okay, I'd just like to begin by welcoming our guests once again, and we'll proceed with my opening statement. First of all, we all know that the COVID pandemic has been raging globally for more than 18 months. It has taken millions of lives and devastated even more livelihoods, setting back the hard-earned progress we've made against poverty and disease. 18 months into this global catastrophe, and the end, unfortunately, is still not in sight. There's no way to end this pandemic except to combat it globally. Americans will continue to be threatened by new emerging strains of the virus the longer we allow it to circulate. We can't get complacent. The COVID virus itself is not slowing down as it adapts to our efforts with new variants. Speed is of the essence. Until we control COVID everywhere, American lives are at risk. That is why hearing from our witnesses today is so critical as we review United States leadership in confronting this pandemic globally. The United States has been noticeably more present and active in the global response in recent months, culminating in September's White House Global COVID-19 Summit. I'm so glad to see us stepping up in this way, but we can and should be doing more to rally others and address ongoing failings in the international response. We need to understand in greater detail the actions taken to date and the future needs. Now, in March 2021, Congress passed the American Rescue Plan Act, which includes $10.8 billion for U.S. aid and the Department of State to address the global impacts of the pandemic. According to information from these agencies, as of September 30th, 57% of these funds have been obligated. These resources have enabled critical support for the distribution of vaccines in low resource settings, continued provision of supplies and expertise to countries suffering from new waves of COVID infections, and given humanitarian support to people made more vulnerable by the pandemic's impacts. The landscape has changed significantly since Congress approved the American Rescue Plan resources. The devastating Delta variant has become the dominant strain of COVID. A barrage of new data shows the crippling impact COVID has had on food security, education, and diseases like tuberculosis. Meanwhile, the COVAX mechanism has been strained in its efforts to deliver vaccines, and there remains incredible inequity in vaccine distribution. It's deeply troubling that while countries like the United States approve booster shots and many other wealthy countries make steady progress, most countries in Africa have vaccinated less than 10% of their eligible population. I'm hoping the witnesses today can help us understand several things. First, how has the United States determined priorities for the resources provided for the global response? How do we balance the need to respond to still climbing infection rates, prevent new infections through vaccination, and mitigate the equally harmful economic and social costs of the pandemic? Second, given the increase in the Biden-Harris administration, commitments made throughout the summer to the global response, commitments, yes, that I applaud, are there adequate resources to continue the fight against this ongoing pandemic? And third, it seems urgent needs are frequently crowding out long-term needs rather than tackling both at the same time. The IMF has warned that failure to end the pandemic globally could cost up to $5.3 trillion in economic losses over 5 years. So how are we working actually across the United States government to ensure we are not going to beat back one health crisis only to face the crisis of food security, poverty, and death? How are the State Department and USAID looking at the longer term impacts of this pandemic and addressing these destabilizing needs? Recovering from the pandemic must mean more than just recovery from the COVID-19 disease. We need to think through how we can help countries build their resilience for the long term and preserve our development and health gains. We also need to be talking to the American people about how our domestic economy and security are inextricably linked with the rest of the world, and that addressing their interests positively impacts our interests. And so I look forward to hearing from each of you on these topics. But before turning to our witnesses for their statements, and given that Ranking Member Rogers was not able to be with us today, let me yield to Congressman Diaz-Balart for any opening remarks that he may have. Congressman Bayard.
Madam Chairwoman, thank you very much. And like you, let me first start by thanking the witnesses today. I look forward to hearing from them. I think you've spoken clearly about some of the concerns that we all have. I particularly remain concerned about China's active COVID-related so-called assistance programs globally. No secret that China is using COVID-19 and the vaccine of COVID-19 to pressure our allies around the planet, and including here in our own hemisphere. So China continues to use that, however, not to help countries, but to coerce other countries to conform to its foreign policy priorities. So I look forward to hearing a little bit also about how we're doing vis-a-vis China. Are we competitive with their efforts, and what you are seeing out there in the world as far as China's aggressive activity and activism using COVID as a way for them to get their foreign policy taken care of. So again, Madam Chairwoman, I thank you for this hearing, and I look forward to listening to our witnesses. And with that, I will yield back.
Thank you very much. Let me ask if our Chairwoman, Chair DeLauro, is on. If so, would she like to have any comments? Hi, Chairwoman DeLauro. I see you now.
Can you? Yes. Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I'm delighted to be with you today and with the committee. It's an important hearing, and I want to say a thank you to the witnesses who are testifying. And even as we have turned a corner with COVID-19 in the U.S., as you pointed out, it is far from over across the globe. Infections are rising in 55 countries. COVID-19 vaccines have been widely available in more developed countries for more than 10 months. Disparities in vaccine access between wealthy and developing countries has meant that even as some of us here are receiving third dose booster shots, many people in lower income countries have not yet received a single dose by some reports. If there is something that we've learned from the pandemic, it is that when one of us suffers, all of us suffer. And when one of us gets sick, we all get sick. John Donne famously wrote in 1624 during another global pandemic, "No one is an island. Anyone's death diminishes all of us because we are all involved in mankind. It is not just our moral imperative to care for those around us. It is the only way to keep ourselves and our own communities safe. So I'm glad that the United States, under the leadership of President Biden, has purchased 1 billion Pfizer doses and donated 100 million vaccine doses from the U.S. stockpile to allocate through the global COVID-19 vaccine collaboration known as COVAX. And I am proud of the 200 million of these COVID-19 vaccines have already been delivered to more than 100 countries around the world. However, there is still much work to be done to support our partners around the world as they fight COVID-19. The United States has to play a leadership role in ending the virus's uncontrolled spread in the world's less developed countries. We need to enhance equitable access to vaccines across the world, making tests, therapeutics, personal protective equipment more widely available. We need to begin the work now to prevent future pandemics by aligning around common global targets, tracking progress, and supporting one another in fulfilling our commitments. I also want to add a note that given that the United States has so heavily invested in the development and the production of the vaccines, that I think it's critical that our pharmaceutical companies work to speed up the production, are actively engaged and involved with assisting countries in allowing countries to of what we did with the waiver at the TRIPS meeting, was to the TRIPS summit, is to allow a waiver so that those countries who can manufacture would be able to manufacture these vaccines, and that we provide the technical assistance for them to be able to deliver them. I think that is just a moral responsibility that we have. So I'm grateful to our witnesses for joining us today to detail actions we have taken thus far, to tell us more about their future needs. I look forward to hearing more from you about the strategies that we can use to distribute these vaccines as efficiently and as equitably as possible. Because ultimately, if we fail to bring the virus under control in every corner of the world, then we must not ask for whom the bell tolls. It will toll for all of us. With that, let me say thank you to Chairwoman Lee, to Ranking Member Rogers, and others of the committee, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Now I would like to yield to, if Representative our ranking member Granger is with us. If not, let me now yield to our witnesses. Ms. Smith, Mr. Konyndyk, Ms. Zieman, and Ms. Charles. If you could summarize your oral statement in less than 5 minutes. I want to make sure that we leave enough time to get our questions. Your full statement, of course, will be included in the record. After your testimony, I'll be calling on members based on seniority of the members that were present when the hearing was called to order, alternating between majority and minority leaders. I'll then recognize any remaining members in the order of their appearance. Each member is asked to keep their questions to within 5 minutes per round. Ms. Smith, please proceed. Good to see you.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Lee and Congressman Diaz-Balart, and also Chairwoman DeLauro. It's a pleasure to see all of you and all the distinguished members of the committee. We're quite pleased to be back with you. I think we've got some good things to report, but that we agree with many of the challenges you've set out in your opening remarks. You do have my written testimony, so let me just summarize on 3 fronts where we are and some of the challenges we face and how we plan to go after them. First is on ramping up the U.S. global response. Since we last met and supported very strongly, and thank you for that, by the American Rescue Plan, we have been able to dramatically increase the scale, scope, and impact of our own response. Chairwoman DeLauro, you mentioned that we had crossed the threshold of sharing over 200 million vaccines to over 100 countries. As soon as we announced that, the number was 210 million, then 215 million. In other words, we are going out on almost a daily basis with shipments. And what we're starting to see is 2 things. One is increasing global coverage, and the second is the beginnings of more robust vaccine uptake in many parts of the world. A couple of other things on the vaccine front I do want to mention. We announced yesterday that we have been able to facilitate a deal between Moderna and the African Union for the African Union to buy additional doses from Moderna. It's 50 million with an additional 60 million as an option. The reason that's important, A, we know that vaccine coverage in Africa is the lowest in the world, but B, and importantly, the African Union asked us to meet them halfway. They organized themselves to purchase half of the continent's vaccine requirements, are now rolling out J&J doses that they paid for. So we are both sharing doses with them as well as facilitating their efforts to procure them. Additionally, the Pfizer doses, with the president having announced an additional 500 million doses at the summit in September, bringing us to a total of 1 billion, are rolling out. These are designated for what's called the 92 AMC countries and the African Union, because there are 8 countries in Africa that are not in COVAX, targeted towards low and low middle income countries. Those are rolling out now in tranches sufficient to allow us to work with countries to make sure they've got the uptake and all the systems in place, and then accelerate the flow on a monthly basis. As you know, the DFC continues, and the acting head of the DFC, Dave Marchek, has just returned from an overseas trip to identify additional places where we can make investments, as we have in India and the Aspen pharmaceutical plant in South Africa, which has already increased its dose levels. Finally, on the vaccine front, we are really trying to get our partners to accelerate the delivery of vaccines. Out of the G20 or the G7 summit, and since that time, we've had robust commitments, particularly from the UK and the European Union. We're very pleased about that. We are urging them to, again, deliver those doses as quickly as possible, and seeking to share with them the knowledge that we've gained from basically building a machine to share vaccines. Against this backdrop, and you will hear more about this from our USAID colleagues who are working with CDC and with PEPFAR, where we're leveraging that platform, we're very focused on delivery, throughput, uptake. How do we make sure that as the supply increases, not sufficiently, but significantly, that we actually have shots in arms? How do we make sure that PPE therapeutics, these other needs, are required for caring for people now who are facing the disease? And how do we continue to respond to surges? I think we all know that the Delta variant was not anticipated in terms of its strength when all of this began early in the pandemic. We know that that's triggered a great deal of need, and I'll let my colleagues speak more to how we've responded to that. The second thing that's been, I think, a big development since we last met is acting on the need for the United States to use its leadership to mobilize the rest of the world. I wish I could say that the entire world was lined up exactly where it needs to be, arm in arm, totally committed to doing everything that needs to be done. That's not the case, and that's why it's critically important that President Biden convened heads of state in September. I will share with you that other than a virtual meeting of the G7 leaders shortly after he came into office, this was the first convening of heads of state on this pandemic. And it was extremely important to do several things. One, we laid down some markers, in part by the robust nature of our own response and our own announcement to do more there, but also by setting ambitious targets. We know what it's going to take to end this pandemic. We decided we needed to put those targets out there, but also, and importantly, measure our progress against them. So we've been working with ACT-A, the suite of organizations you all know well, the Global Fund, COVAX, WHO, CEPI, and others, but also with what's called the Multilateral Task Force. This is the heads of the World Bank, IMF, WHO, and WTO, to make sure that collectively we can track the world's progress against these targets, hold ourselves and others available, and measure constantly where we are and where we need to be. Another goal of the summit was to create some momentum. We could have convened a summit, had it be very successful, and then just reverted back. What we've decided to do instead was generate the momentum that's needed. So we had the summit, the G20 summit is upon us now. In November, the Secretary of State will convene foreign ministers. Again, this is the first convening of foreign ministers to mobilize the political and other capital we need from them. In December, we anticipate a G7 meeting on vaccines hosted by the UK, and there will be another summit after the first of the year. These action-forcing events allow us to drive others and ourselves towards key targets, so we really think it's vital. Also, and importantly, the summit and these other events aren't just about governments. We've engaged the private sector extensively. We think there's a real possibility of additional significant support from there, particularly on vaccine delivery, foundations, and NGOs. Finally, the third point I'd just like to refer to is the long-term global health security. I'm seeing my clock, and I will simply say I'll come back to this in Q&A. But we believe and are laying down some markers now because we can't wait till we've ended this pandemic to lay the ground for preparation for the future. Happy to say more about that, but let me revert to and return to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Smith. Let me ask now Mr. Konyndyk to please proceed.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Lee, Representative Diaz-Balart, and Chairwoman DeLauro for the opportunity to testify today about USAID's role in the global COVID-19 response. Chairwoman Lee, your opening statement actually hit so many of the points that I was planning to make. I'm not sure I need to say anything, but I'll make just a few comments. No crisis in our lifetimes, and I've managed many in my career, has matched this pandemic in terms of scope and complexity. It is three overlapping crises: a health crisis, a humanitarian crisis, and an economic and development crisis. Each of those historic in their own right, unprecedented in scale, and each of them hitting at the exact same time. Thanks to Congress's generosity, as Gail also referenced, USAID has been able to expand our response to these crises, and we have now provided pandemic aid to more than 120 countries, totaling more than $9 billion in resources. Our work remains guided by the White House's Global Response and Recovery Framework for COVID-19, with 5 objectives that are laid out in my written testimony, and which we've briefed you on before. That framework also provided the foundation for the commitments that President Biden laid out and the targets that he laid out at the summit that Gail just discussed. That we focused that in line with our strategy on vaccinating the world, on saving lives now, all of the things beyond vaccination, things like oxygen and testing and so on, that are critical to the frontline health response, and to building back better against future pandemics. But as you said in your opening, Chairwoman, the world has been changing since the ARP was passed. And the evolution of the pandemic and the risks it has posed has also forced adaptation in how we are responding. And I want to just cite a few of the specific ways here. First, we have seen enormous challenges with global vaccine supply, and much slower than expected and slower than hoped for production of vaccines, particularly some of the key vaccines that were expected to be the frontline vaccines for low-income countries. And that slow delivery is due to a few things. It's due to very tight supply chains for global vaccine inputs. In effect, what the world is trying to do is produce an extra 11 or more billion vaccines on top of an architecture that is normally built to produce 5 billion doses a year. That has also contributed to major production delays at some of the large vaccine manufacturers. The way that those vaccine manufacturers are allocating doses across their different contracts is very opaque. But it does seem that low-income countries in COVAX are consistently at the end of the queue there. And then there have been export restrictions, particularly some of the export restrictions put in place by India that have taken a lot of Indian production off the table for the rest of the world. The administration has responded to this, as you know, by ramping up our own sharing of vaccines abroad. And so we have up till now shared more than 200 million doses total, on track towards 1.2 billion planned, which will be 1 billion doses that we are committed to purchasing from Pfizer for global distribution, as well as plans to share a total of 200 million surplus doses from our own domestic supply. The second major change has been that country vaccination costs are rising, and the complexity is growing. And so we are finding a lot of variation in country readiness for distribution of vaccines, and the complexity in particular of the Pfizer vaccine, which is a phenomenally effective vaccine but has more complex and onerous handling and cost requirements, has added to the ticket price there, as it were. And third, as I think as others have discussed, the Delta variant has greatly magnified global risks. We have been responding to more and worse hotspots than had been the case previously. I think everyone tracked the crisis in India in the spring, but we've seen those kinds of conditions on other scales in many other countries, and so that has placed an additional burden on our budget. And the net outcome of all of this is that as this race between the vaccines, our other response, and the variants continues, we are running through our resources very quickly. Of the ARP funds that have been made available to USAID, we expect to have not more than around $250 million left as we head into next year. And next year will be the most operationally intensive phase of the response as we work to roll out vaccines globally to hit the 70% global coverage target. So we look forward to your questions. We're very glad that Congress continues to focus on this issue, and we are grateful for your support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Konyndyk. Now I would like to ask Ms. Zieman to proceed with your testimony. Thank you again.
Thank you. Chairwoman Lee, Congressman Diaz-Balart, Chairwoman DeLauro, distinguished members of the subcommittee, it is an honor to appear before you today. I look forward to sharing with you how the department's Bureau for Population, Refugees, and Migration has utilized the supplemental funding generously provided by the committee and the entire Congress, not once, but twice, to allow us to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the COVID-19 pandemic for some of the world's most vulnerable people. As you noted, the existence of COVID-19 anywhere is a threat to global health and security everywhere, and the ARP resources have allowed PRM to focus on mitigating COVID-19 among those most often overlooked. Even before the pandemic, the world was facing the highest levels of displacement ever seen, an 88% increase between 2010 and 2020. Those displaced are regularly without health care and have risked going untested and untreated for COVID-19. Further, they faced immediate and profound economic, education, social, and mental health impacts. PRM's international organization partners rapidly issued emergency appeals that moved from immediate COVID-19 prevention and case management support to sustaining education, responding to alarming spikes in gender-based violence, expanding mental health support, and sustaining livelihoods. Since the beginning of the pandemic, PRM has provided more than $831 million in more than 80 countries. Through the ARP funding, our partners are providing essential healthcare, clean water, sanitation, shelter, protection, and last-mile COVID-19 vaccination efforts. Humanitarians are responding to a global twindemic of COVID-19 and displacement through immense dedication, innovation, and partnership. In our response, we have recognized the importance of established local community partners. As borders closed and movement of people and goods ground to a halt, PRM and UN support to local organizations provided continuity of assistance. The trust local organizations built allowed them to quickly implement an unprecedented response, even when asking people to take very difficult steps to mitigate the spread of the disease. As a result, with the ARP funds, we have prioritized increasing direct programming to our NGO partners. A second lesson was ensuring interventions involved host communities and promoted innovative delivery strategies, such as an expansion in community-based mental health services where trained neighbors provided support to others. With the increase in gender-based violence, PRM is also supporting our partners to mainstream gender-based violence prevention and support services into health, education, and livelihoods programming. PRM-funded partners innovated GBV case management by creating support lifelines, whether by phone or trained community members. We recognize that vaccinations will be the critical pandemic off-ramp for vulnerable populations. In March 2021, 59% of country vaccination plans did not include refugees. PRM and our partners have been strongly advocating for the equitable inclusion of displaced persons in vaccine planning. Thanks in part to these efforts, the UN Refugee Agency is now reporting that 121 out of 123 countries have begun providing COVID-19 vaccinations for refugees or other peoples of concern. We know it is possible to achieve high coverage vaccination in refugee communities when supplies are available and humanitarians are engaged in a coordinated vaccination program. COVID-19 has demonstrated how interconnected we are, from the spread of the disease to the global economic impacts. This has driven home the imperative that the world not forget to ensure health and security through humanitarian assistance for refugees and other displaced persons. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Zieman. Let me now ask our final witness, Ms. Charles, to come forward. And thank you again.
Yeah. Chairwoman Lee, Representative Diaz-Balart, Chairwoman DeLauro, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify about the U.S. Agency for International Development's humanitarian response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic is a crisis multiplier, making complex emergencies even more complex and compounding the effects of conflict and climate change to not only exacerbate humanitarian needs, but also change the way in which we deliver humanitarian assistance. There are record levels of need globally. 235 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance and protection this year, a 40% increase over last year. More than 2 billion people do not have access to adequate food. Almost a decade of progress against malnutrition has been erased. The COVID-19 pandemic has also given rise to a second nefarious pandemic, the shadow pandemic of gender-based violence against women and girls. Loss of income from the economic downturn, limited mobility due to public health regulations, closures of schools, markets, and support services, and widespread stress have led to an increase in violence in the home, while also creating barriers for women and girls to access life-saving services. And the grim reality is that while the number of people in need is growing, the number of people we can reach with the same amount of funding is decreasing due to global supply chain disruptions. Despite these challenges, thanks to the generosity of the United States Congress, humanitarian assistance from the American people has helped mitigate the worst of the crisis through a robust global response that has helped millions of vulnerable people around the world. We've programmed more than $2.3 billion in supplemental humanitarian assistance across 53 countries, including more than $1.8 billion in American Rescue Plan resources to meet these increased needs. We've also worked with our partners to make strategic adaptations to our programs to ensure continuity of services and to protect communities and aid workers from disease transmission. For food assistance, this means increasing the frequency of distributions to avoid overcrowding, and even providing door-to-door distributions for elderly and other higher risk cases. For health, this means delivering critical medical supplies, countering misinformation about COVID-19, and educating local communities about how to stop the spread. For survivors of gender-based violence, it means Zainab and her team in northern Nigeria shifted to remote case management by telephone in order to continue providing services to survivors despite restrictions on movement. Being a gender-based violence survivor herself, Zainab knows well the difficult circumstances that women are facing due to this shadow pandemic. And through her work, she's dedicated to helping other survivors and creating a more equitable world for her daughters. USAID is also making strategic investments to build the capacity of the international humanitarian system to respond to public health emergencies in the future and to make vulnerable communities more resilient. I'm proud of our work to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, to maintain ongoing programming, and to stand up critical new responses to emergent crises in Afghanistan, after the earthquake in Haiti and northern Ethiopia, in the Northern Triangle and beyond. Having almost depleted our supplemental resources responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, we're preparing to make a series of difficult choices in fiscal years 22 and 23, as the divide between humanitarian needs and resources continues to grow across all sectors. Our work is needed now more than ever. Going forward, the international community must continue to work together to scale up services, adapt and innovate programming, and prepare for future outbreaks in humanitarian settings. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Charles. Let me go straight into the questions now, and I'll be very brief with mine because many of my questions I asked in my opening statement. So I'd just like to ask Ms. Smith, you know, the question about the United States using its power of influence to get greater action from other donors, including the private sector, especially pharmaceutical companies and international bodies such as the World Bank.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Look, this is absolutely critical, and I think we know from all of our work over the last decades that when we step up and lead, other countries follow, but also, quite frankly, that we can use our leadership and the resources that we put on the table to leverage those from others. So that's what we have been doing on a number of fronts. I think with our key partner countries that are also major donors, we are working aggressively with them to encourage that they increase some of their numbers. We are very fortunate to have had ARP resources, but we want to see increased resources from them. And as I said earlier, to accelerate the flow of their surplus vaccines. We really need that to speed up. We're getting some traction on that, including through the summit and these other action forcing events. As I referenced, our conversations with the private sector, I think have been of a very different nature than I've ever seen. I've been in this work for a long time, where we urge them to respond at scale and systemically. In other words, are there ways they can come together? Those discussions are very, very fruitful. And we're hoping in the not too distant future, we'll have more to say about that. But it's been a very serious, in-depth discussion there. We've seen American foundations step up, but also importantly, and we've discussed this with them, reaching out to other philanthropies around the world so that we are leveraging both from the public sector and the private sector. Our engagement with the vaccine manufacturers is extensive. Importantly, at the summit, we called for greater transparency in supply, production, and availability of vaccines, because one of the challenges we face is being able to plan out 1 quarter, 2 quarters, and know what we're dealing with. Much of that engagement is led by the White House task force that has led on the US response. And again, I think we are having impact there, but those are all relationships that we're going to have to continue to engage on.
Thank you.
So it's a big priority across the board.
I will now yield to Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Madam Chairwoman, thank you very much. Again, let me thank all of you for what you do and your service to our country. And I know that you have difficult tasks. I do want to kind of my very short opening remark, I talked a lot about China and about my concern about China. And even though I think summits can be positive, summits are not a solution, or summits are not a victory. You know, the historic Abrams Accords took place without summits. China hasn't had a lot of summits, and yet they're being very, very aggressive. The vaccines were produced in the United States in less than a year without summits. They were produced by just, hard work and a lot of behind the scenes pressure and hard work. So I'm a little concerned that I've heard a lot about summits, but even though some good numbers were posted, and I think that's helpful and that's great, I still haven't heard anything about the contrast between what we've been able to do and what China has been able to do. And so if somebody wants to give me an idea as to how we're doing vis-a-vis what China has been doing, I think would be very helpful.
Sure. May I? And my colleague Jeremy may want to add to this. Congressman, I agree with you. Summits are a means to an end, not the end in themselves. And we clearly saw the summit as a means to an end, and these other events we see in the same way because they are action-forcing events. With respect to China, you're absolutely right that China has been very aggressive, very assertive, and quite frankly, a bit transactional with respect to vaccines. What we have found at a very practical level is that, number one, the demand for the vaccines that we can make available, Moderna, Pfizer, J&J, are extremely high. There's a great level of confidence. So that's number one. Number two, we have found that because our posture with vaccines is that these do not come with political strings. In other words, we are not saying that we will provide you vaccines if you will do A, B, or C. We are saying that these vaccines are tools to end a pandemic that threatens all of us, and we're taking the lead in the world to get everybody vaccinated. That resonates with people. I think it resonates with citizens. It resonates with governments who are looking for vaccines for the same reason. So I think part of what we have done is we're not going to compete on the same terms. We're not going to use this as a chess game. We are going to stand on some fundamental principles. Number one, that these are not political tools. This is acting on our values and our collective and national self-interest. And secondly, we're going to count on the science and the efficacy. Again, the reputation of these vaccines is very, very high. and the demand is great. So I don't want to discount in any way the importance of the issue that you raise, but I think if your question is, how are we doing? I think the world greatly appreciates both our science, innovation, and industry, but also the fact that we're sharing vaccines with no strings attached.
If I could just add to that briefly, I think we in China are taking different approaches, and I think part of the contrast and part of the soft power dimension here, frankly, is that we and they are doing very different things. They are trying to sell vaccines for the most part. They are not donating them. They are, and as I think you said, Congressman, they are using this often as coercion rather than as assistance. I think we are very explicitly, and as the president has repeatedly said, doing this as assistance. And we are far ahead of them on that front. We have now given more than 200 million doses abroad already. Their donations lag far behind that. We have committed to provide another billion beyond what we have already done. And I think the feedback we get from countries, frankly, is that they prefer the vaccines that we are providing and want more of them. And I think that as we are making more of our vaccines available, which countries generally prefer, that also limits the room, frankly, for China to exert coercive tactics, because countries have a choice. And when countries have a choice, we're seeing consistently they would prefer to choose the vaccines that are coming through COVAX and from the US.
Great, Madam Chairwoman. I only have less than half a minute, so I will yield back. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll yield now to the chair of the Appropriations Committee, Congresswoman, Chairwoman Roosevelt.
Okay, thank you so much, Madam Chair and Congressman Diaz-Balart. Just a quick comment. I was pleased to hear about the discussions with Moderna and increased production. However, I think what we need to do, clearly, because there simply isn't enough vaccine being made by the pharmaceutical companies, but I'm also very concerned about what I view, and I'll be clear about this, they're exploiting intellectual property, their monopolies on intellectual property by refusing to negotiate with other the capable manufacturers around the world. That's something that I think that we have to that we have to address. Let me get to a question on. I do have a question on why our emphasis is on donation versus production, but let me just do this. This is about surplus doses. The administration's estimate of surplus doses by the end of 2021. Are we going to donate these? If not, why not? What steps are we going to take if we were to donate some or all of these doses? And do we have a plan for shipping vaccine doses that are close to expiring to countries that are desperate for vaccines?
I'm happy to take a start at that and then hand over to my USAID colleague. Thank you, Congresswoman, for those questions. And I'm not sure I would state it as that donation is prioritized over production. We are trying to do both. So, for example, the DFC investment in Aspen is a little bit of a twofer. It increases production over the long term, which is critical, but it also increases production in the urgency of now, where we're trying urgently to contain this virus. We very much agree that long-term investment for the kind of architecture that we need, where we've got more geographical distribution, more availability and access to vaccines, is absolutely critical. And that's one of the things we're looking at. Yes, these surplus doses are donated. And in addition to the surplus doses from our stock are the 1 billion Pfizer doses, which the United States paid for and is donating to COVAX. So we are not getting into the business of offering to sell, for example, surplus doses or those Pfizer doses to low and lower middle income countries. Those are absolutely donated. Second, we have had to build a bit of a machine to be able to deliver those. There are a lot of regulatory, legal, logistical, and other hurdles that must be gone through on our end and on the receiving country's end. I'm pleased to report that due to the work of a lot of agencies and our colleagues on the domestic task force, we've got that system down. We are not aiming to share vaccines that have a short expiration date. That's a really high risk to receiving countries that they won't be able to deliver them on time. And frankly, it's just the wrong thing to do. So with the Pfizer doses, they're just coming off the production line. They've got a sufficiently long timeline on expiration that delivery should be quite possible without any risk of expiration. Thank you.
And what we're seeing from our colleagues on the domestic side, and we're coordinating very closely with them, is that very consistently, as they are receiving the deliveries from the manufacturers, if those are surplus to the point in time domestic requirements or anticipated domestic requirements, they are turning around and donating those. So for example, we recently received the completion of the deliveries from Johnson & Johnson, and a large chunk of that we turned around and have committed now to the African Union, 17 million doses to the African Union. So the doses that we are holding on to are really those that are being expected to be used domestically. We're not otherwise sitting on doses. And on Gail's point about the doses close to expiry, I think it would distinguish between those that are already out in the States and those that have been received and are still in the possession of the federal government. Once those have gone out to states, it's very hard to donate those abroad because of chain of custody issues. So we have looked hard at that. HHS has looked hard at that. We defer to HHS on this, but so far they haven't found a reliably safe way to do that, unfortunately.
Just a couple comments with the remaining time that I have is that I will go back to the intellectual property monopolies that these pharmaceutical companies have and their refusal to negotiate with other capable manufacturers around the world. That is an issue that has to be addressed if we really are going to make a difference in fostering a humanitarian effort here. And that we have to break the back of. The final point is, do we know what will the administration do to deliver a final waiver deal by November 30th at the WTO ministerial? U.S. has supported it, but it's down to Germany, the UK, and Switzerland versus the rest of the world on this. Do we know what?
Yeah, I would refer you to USTR on this in terms of the very latest. As you know, these negotiations are happening in real time, and you and I've discussed this before. I can assure you that on USTR's part, the State Department's part, and others of us, we've been actively working with other countries to see what progress we can achieve. But USTR will have the latest on that because it's all happening in real time right now.
Okay, and the continued effort with the pharmaceutical companies.
Yes.
Moderna would not have been able to provide the vaccine unless there had been over about $10 billion of U.S. taxpayers' dollars to produce that vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Now I yield now to Mr. Rushenthaler.
Thank you, Chairwoman Lee. I appreciate it. And I'd like to echo the sentiments of my good friend, Mario Diaz-Balart, when he said thank you to the witnesses for not only being here, but for all the hard work you do every day and everything you do for everybody. I do want to focus, though, on some funding, of course. Now, just so you know, in May, when Administrator Samantha Power was here and testified, I asked a few questions regarding the COVID-19 pandemic and specifically funding that was going to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The administrator told me she'd only been on the job for a few weeks. I get that. I was told that she'd get back to me. I'd get my questions. We're 5 months past that. I still have gotten zero answers from any of my questions. Now, in that time, we do know that information has come out that confirmed what I said in May of 2020. And that said, the Wuhan Institute of Virology was likely the epicenter and the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, that EcoHealth Alliance was sending money to the Wuhan Institute of Virology to do gain-of-function research. Dr. Fauci testified just a few months ago that the NIH has, and I quote him, has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, end quote. No, look, we can have a discussion on gain-of-function research, where it should be done, if it's appropriate, totally separate discussion on that. But I just want to repeat to the witnesses the questions that I had asked Administrator Power a few months ago. Mr. Konyndyk, is US aid currently funding authorized or unauthorized gain-of-function research Mr. Konyndyk, I'll yield to you, and then I'll go to Ms. Charles.
Thanks. Yeah, and I can handle that one. It's not under Assistant Administrator Charles's remit. So just to be very clear, USAID does not approve through its funding dual use or gain of function studies to increase infectivity, transmissibility, or lethality of viruses.
Thank you. I appreciate the crisp, clear response, and I'm not trying to be snarky when I say that. Truly, I appreciate it. Then does the Biden administration support the decision from the last administration then to end U.S. aid activities in China beyond WIV? I mean, just all U.S. aid activities in China.
So we have not. On the broader China question, I think it'd probably be. I can't really speak beyond the health and the COVID space in my current role, so I defer to some of my colleagues in the Asia Bureau about whether there are other things that they would advise we should be doing in terms of development cooperation with China. I think there are potentially arguments for that. I can say that with respect to our global health security investments, we have not made any additional global health security investments and funding in China, whether to the WIV or elsewhere. And I think that as a general rule, the administration has been very clear that we expect to see greater transparency and greater accountability from China. And there are a number of questions that we want answered that the president has talked about, and that others in the administration have talked about in terms of greater transparency on the track record of that lab. So I think at this point, well, I can't say we definitely would not. I don't want to rule out every circumstance. We are not currently, and I think we'll stay on that course for the time being.
What about just what about a prohibition on funding? If we just want to narrow it down, what about a prohibition on any funding going to any labs that are controlled by the PLA?
Well, as I said, we're not. You're referring to labs inside China solely, or
yes, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just focused on China.
Yeah.
I mean, what about a prohibition on just any money going to labs that are controlled by the People's Liberation Army?
Well, again, we're not putting any additional funding at this point into cooperation, laboratory cooperation in China, whether controlled by the People's Liberation Army or not. So, I mean, I think that would be, consistent with what we're doing now, just as a policy matter. But
oh yeah, I totally get that. I was just saying if we move forward and start to refund, how about a prohibition?
Oh, okay.
I'm saying prospectively, yeah.
I see. Yeah, we could study that. I don't have it's kind of a speculative answer, and depending on what parameters would we put onto something that if we started doing something we're not doing currently. So it's, but I think in general, what we do want to be sure of is that and some of the new work that we're doing in this area outside of China, under some of our new programs, we have built in new and more robust training and accountability requirements, including detailed biosafety plans and so on from anyone receiving direct or subgranted U.S. funding. And so, any entity that couldn't or wouldn't sign that kind of an agreement wouldn't be eligible for our funding.
Thank you, Mr. Konyndyk, and Madam Chair, thank you for your generosity with the time. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I'll yield now to Ms. May.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you to all our witnesses for being here and for the important life-saving work you've led throughout this pandemic. Just to follow up a little bit about funding, I appreciate what you just mentioned about some of the transparency standards that have been used. Just wanted to know where international funding has been going in general. How were those decisions made? As of today, how much U.S. government funding has been allocated for the global COVID-19 response? How much of that money is left? When will that money run out? I know that our subcommittee under the leadership of Chairwoman Lee appropriated almost $11 billion earlier this year, but we know that this is likely not sufficient to meet the global need, but it was a very important place to start.
Gail, do you want to talk to the broad picture and I'll talk to Aid?
Sure. I mean, the fact of the matter, and again, I just want to underscore the gratitude that we feel for having those ARP resources, because it's really enabled us to ramp this up with both the financial and other support from all of you. The bulk of that funding, in fact, is either obligated, out in the field, planned for, or otherwise designated by the terms of the ARP itself. So, I mean, that's the way to look at it. And our decisions on spending have been guided in the main by the categories and the direction contained in the ARP, which thankfully is very coincident with a very, very smart response. So for example, if you take the funding that was allocated to the Global Fund, half of that has been made available thus far. We still have the other half, but it is designated for the Global Fund. So we count that as basically planned for. So we will see that we're going to face a shortfall in funds at some time in the not too distant future. We are tracking across agencies where that is, where we still have leeway, where we don't, and again, trying to augment by leveraging others and getting other countries to stand up and bringing in the private sector and other actors. But again, while not all of it has been spent on the ground, the bulk of those resources are sufficiently obligated or planned for that we will face a time when we do run out of sufficient funds in the not too distant future. Jeremy, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, so speaking specifically to some of the work that AID has been doing, so there's about $4.2 billion that has from the ARP that has been made available to USAID. Some of that was directly earmarked to us in the bill, and some of that was appropriated as shared AID and state money, and is being shared between our agencies. So of that $4.2 billion, we have now obligated around $3.5 billion. We have additional pending allocations that we'll be sending up notifications to Hill on shortly, related to some of the summit targets and a few other obligatory activities that were called for in the bill that will run down most of the rest of that funding. And so we anticipate that as we head into the end of the year and early next year, we will be down, out of that $4.2 billion that we've been working with, we'll be down to around $250 million left to allocate as we head into 2022, and that will be the most intensive operational period of the pandemic as we try to roll out vaccines across the entirety of the world and get low-income countries to 70% coverage. Just to give a sense of kind of the scale of what we're up against, some of the targets, the funding targets that were referenced in the President's Summit. We challenged the world to generate up to $10 billion for vaccine readiness and deployment, up to $2 billion to support global oxygen. Oxygen support is after vaccines. Oxygen support is the next biggest request that we get from other countries, including, and this was obviously famously a huge challenge in India. We think it's a fixable challenge with resources. There is a path to get the oxygen crisis dealt with, but it will take resources. We also challenged the world and ourselves to come up with $3 billion for other therapeutic treatments for COVID-19, as well as costs related to diagnostics and other priorities. So there is a lot of work yet to do in the coming year, and I think we have burned through the ARP resources rather rapidly because of, as we talked about at the beginning, the Delta variant and some of the other changes that has driven in the pandemic over the past year.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Now I will yield to Ms. Wexton.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I also want to add my voice to the chorus of folks on this committee, thanking all the folks who are here today for all the work that you've been doing during the pandemic to help stop the spread and keep people safe. I do want to build on some of the questions from Mr. Diaz-Balart and Mr. Reschenthaler about China, but also about Russia and what they've been doing in terms of spreading their vaccine around. Have you seen them be aggressive about distributing the Sputnik vaccine, and what kind of response have you received from what have you seen from countries about taking it from them?
I'll make just a couple comments and again, turn to my colleague to add additional comments. Actually, we've seen relatively little uptake of the Russian vaccine. It has not been approved by WHO, and to most countries that matters because that emergency authorization does give an indication of safety and efficacy. Excuse me, and we've actually seen some countries that had ordered it or planned to use it have now ceased using it out of some concerns of reports on some of the side effects. So there's a great contrast between China and Russia in terms of the push availability of that vaccine, as well as near as we can tell, production of the Sputnik virus is not as high as production of some other vaccines. So that's kind of where it stands on the Russian vaccine. Jeremy, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, the Sputnik vaccine has a very active Twitter account. It doesn't have nearly as active a global distribution. And again, Gail's exactly right. You know, they have dramatically overpromised what they can do. They're not meeting their deliveries, and it's not an emergency use listed vaccine by the WHO. So we're not seeing much of an appetite for Sputnik from other countries. And yeah, I think that, you know, the Chinese vaccine, Sinovac and Sinopharm, are just much larger factors in the global production landscape. Sputnik isn't really registering in that sense.
Well, I want to thank you for providing the perfect segue to my next question, which is that it's my understanding that there's some groups that may be driving disinformation about the efficacy and safety of Western vaccines. What information do you have about what groups are doing this and what can we do to combat it? I mean, I understand that Twitter isn't real life, but it does have a great impact on, you know, social media and everything of what people believe.
Absolutely. I mean, I think so some of that we should probably get into not in an open setting, but we'd be happy to provide a classified briefing on some of that. But yeah, in general, you know, there's no shortage of vaccine disinformation. Some of that is coming from state actors, certain Twitter accounts, and so on. Some of that, of course, is just coming from the enormous anti-vaccine voices that we've seen in many countries, including our own. We are, through our programs that are promoting vaccine uptake around the world, we are working to directly counter that, and we're working with country partners, but also importantly with civil society and private sector partners to counter that. One of the things that we've been discussing with some of our private sector partners that Gail referenced earlier is how they can use their outreach networks, their communication networks, some of their advertising to promote vaccine confidence. And so that is an intentional focus of some of our programming, and I think it's going to be very important as we head into the next year. We're already seeing in some countries, including Haiti and parts of Southern Africa, that even at fairly low levels of vaccine supply availability, there is so much hesitancy that they're not able to find enough demand for what they're supplying. And so I think that is going to be a significant challenge in the year ahead.
Yes, and that's a great concern to me because the social media groups, you know, the WhatsApps and the Facebooks and everything, their minimal protections are even less in languages other than English. So that is a great concern. Thank you so much. Now, Ms. Zieman, how can we reach vulnerable populations in insecure environments? You know, so groups like the Uyghurs in China or the women in Afghanistan, how can we ensure that they actually have access to vaccine?
Thank you. I'll start answering and then let others jump in. But most of our partners have been able to stay and deliver due to our ability to provide them with safety equipment and protections. And many of our partners, particularly the International Committee of the Red Cross, is regularly operating in areas of conflict that are hard to reach. And they have been providing through our contributions both COVID mitigation and COVID response assistance, and are working with us to provide last mile vaccinations in efforts that others in government countries cannot reach.
Very good. Thank you. I see that my time has expired, so I will yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wexler. Now I will yield to Ms. Frankel. Ms. Frankel, are you able to get on? There may be some technical problems. If so, we'll come back to Ms. Frankel. Is Mr. Price on? If not, I will yield to Mr. Espaillat.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For Jeremy Konyndyk, Konyndyk, the question is, basically in 2020, most Caribbean countries were forced to close down their borders to curb the spread of COVID-19, resulting in a halt to their economy. And many of the economies there are driven by tourism, obviously. This led to a contraction of their economy, estimated at 8.6% of the entire region. And as you know, the Caribbean is the United States' sixth largest trading partner and really our third border. Now, China and others have did very well with Latin America and the Caribbean regarding vaccine distribution. But now we've sort of like turned the page, and there's an opportunity to help rebuild their economies, right? So I wanted to know if you can provide an update first on vaccination efforts in the Caribbean, and what could be our plans to potentially, help them more so that they can get their economies up and running again.
Thanks so much for that question. And yeah, absolutely share your assessment of the importance of increasing vaccination in the Caribbean, as well as helping to foster economic recovery. So far during the pandemic, USAID has allocated around $63 million in development relief and assistance to COVID-related needs in the region, and that has run the gamut from health and COVID assistance, economic growth support, and humanitarian assistance. That's 40 million of that has been directly for health assistance related to COVID in countries like Haiti, Jamaica, the DR, and smaller island states in the region. And that's included things like PPE, testing and diagnostic support, training for healthcare workers, and so on. We have also been providing vaccine doses to many countries across the Caribbean, including some of the small island states. And we've done that in partnership with the regional body CARICOM and with the Pan American Health Organization. So I think we are doing a great deal in the region, and Gail may want to say more about some of the specific vaccine distribution that we've done with CARICOM. As we look ahead, I think would agree that there is going to be a need for more support to spurring the economic recovery there. And I think on that front, as we look at the development resources that are available to the agency over the next few years, in the Caribbean, as in the wider world, it's going to be a real priority for us to make sure that we are working to accelerate the economic recovery as the pandemic hopefully begins to recede.
And if I may, I would just add one quick point on the end of that. We're pleased that our vaccine distribution and allocations to CARICOM are on the upswing. And that will continue, by the way. But the other thing I want to mention here is that one of the critical roles in this, and particularly the recovery and resilience side, is the Treasury Department and its work with the bank and the fund, including on special drawing rights, the creation of a new facility at the IMF designed to respond, Congressman, to exactly the problem you described. Countries that have seen dramatic falls in, for example, tourism or other revenue, and then have been hit on top of that by the direct pandemic itself. So in addition to what we do through USAID, we are also more at the macro level, but I think quite significantly in terms of resources, very much supporting Treasury's effort to leverage and make those funds available, because this is going to be a long-term, very, very significant recovery.
Real quick now to Ms. Leslie Zieman. What is being done at the border to help vaccinate asylum seekers, refugees, and immigrants? It seems that we're not doing enough, and as a result, they're wide open to get COVID-19 and spread it. What is the protocol to deal with refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants at the Del Rio border area?
I would have to refer you to CDC and DHS for specifics of vaccinations and COVID mitigation on the US side of the border. However, in Mexico and throughout Central America, the PRM is utilizing its resources through the ARP to provide COVID mitigation and response measures. So again, we're responding to vulnerable migrants in those areas, much like we are throughout the rest of the hemisphere.
But you're not sure what happens in the US side of the border. Once an immigrant comes across, what happens with regards to vaccination?
So we're currently operating under Title 42 order through CDC. I would note under that there are pathways available for humanitarian needs, and those, and in that process, there is a COVID mitigation processes. But again, I would have to refer you to CDC on more specifics on in the US.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Now I will yield to Mr. Price.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Sorry I had to leave the hearing for just a moment. I do want to make note of the various testimony that we've heard this morning about vaccines alone not being enough. Vaccine delivery, the vaccine delivery workforce is such an important element in all this. The COVID summit set this in very ambitious goal of 70% of the world being vaccinated within a year, and there's no way to do that, of course, with vaccine support alone. It's going to have to involve a lot of work to get those vaccines delivered in the parts of the world we're talking about. I want to use my time to raise a question that hasn't been directly raised, but it's, I know, of direct interest to our aid witnesses and to all of us. And that has to do with governance and the relationship between governance in the countries of the world that we're talking about, which is virtually every country, and the interaction between governance and the progress of the pandemic. On the one hand, I don't know if you have any studies or any conclusions thus far about which kinds of governments have done the best with the pandemic. I know the picture's mixed, but there's some sense that the pandemic is better controlled by strong, even authoritarian governments. I don't think the evidence bears that out, but I wonder what we do know about that. But then the other side of the equation, the converse, is that the pandemic certainly threatens democracy. And there are many instances that we know of where pandemic measures have been used to tighten controls and to tighten autocracies and to shut down pluralistic forces. So that's of course a work in progress. But I'd appreciate your reflections on this and what the evidence so far shows, because we, of course, in this country have a strong stake in human rights and in supporting democratic governance worldwide.
Thank you very much for that, Congressman Price. Yeah, I think the evidence certainly doesn't indicate that authoritarian governments are better at containing the pandemic. I think, well, first stipulate, of course, a lot more research needs to be done as we see how this continues to play out. But I think one of the themes we see emerging, and this is something that Tom Boyke at the Council on Foreign Relations has written about and researched. Trust in government is a really important factor in a government in a country's ability to control the response. And where you see higher trust in government, you see better compliance with public health measures, more confidence in the vaccines, and so on. And where that trust in government and in institutions is low, it is harder to control the pandemic. Ultimately, and this is a lesson I think not just from COVID, but from many outbreaks that many of us have fought over the years, is just the centrality of trust at a community level, at a national level. Gail and I worked in the past on the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, and we saw there as well trust being so important, because ultimately what you need is, communities need to own the response. They need and people need to adapt their own behavior to avoid risk and to take the measures they need to take. And if they don't trust the sources they're hearing that from, they won't necessarily take those measures. And we saw a real turnaround in West Africa when communities were hearing risk messaging from credible voices that they trusted. And I think we've seen that now on a global scale with COVID as well.
What about the converse effect. The government's using COVID as a pretext for what they probably wanted to do all along in terms of autocratic measures.
We've seen a lot of that, and it's always a little bit of a kind of chicken and the egg challenge to know what would have happened. The counterfactual is not always clear. So, would a crackdown not have happened if not for COVID? Clearly, a government that's cracking down wants to crack down. They're not just doing it because of the pandemic. But I think there are a number of instances where the pandemic, as you say, provided a pretext to recover for a political crackdown that may have been desired in any case. It's hard to parse those apart, but we have seen a number of places, Ethiopia being one, for example, where a political crisis that had much deeper roots than COVID was accelerated and exacerbated by COVID. And I think it just gets to a larger point that as long as this pandemic continues, we will face major systemic risks and elevated systemic risks. It's hard to predict where and when those will blow up, but I think we can predict broadly that more will continue to.
Well, in engaging with parliaments, for example, in the House Democracy Partnership, and of course, the IRI, NDI, these NGOs on the ground are engaging. This question of how the pandemic is handled, how those countries are faring, but also the implications for governance. These questions loom large, and I think they will be with us for a long time to come.
I absolutely agree. We're going to be dealing with the fallout of this for many years.
Thank you, Mr. Price. Let me now yield to Ms. Frankel if her technical issues have been resolved. Ms. Frankel.
Madam Chair, I don't even know where to start because I couldn't get on, then I got thrown off, and then I got on, and I got thrown off. So.
Well, welcome.
I apologize. I just don't. I may be asking you something that's already been discussed, but I think I really just have a very overall general question, which is, what is the prognosis? I mean, I know for us to get the situation here under control, there has to be some way to help the other countries. But what is the real prognosis of us being able to do that?
I'm happy to make a comment on that. And I'd like to express my solidarity to the Congresswoman for the experience of being thrown off and on web-based meetings. We all experience it quite a lot. But I think yours is really the vital question. I think, we're all fond of saying nobody is safe until everybody's safe, but it's actually true. It's a really good slogan, but it's really, really true. So the imperatives are clear. I think our view is that what it will take is meeting the targets we put out at the summit. In other words, we need to get to that 70% vaccination coverage in every country, in every income category. It isn't sufficient just for the wealthy countries to achieve that, right? The virus pays no attention to what country it's in or what border it crosses. I think our prognosis, and that's only one proxy for what we need to do, because remember, we also need to be building the foundations that we need so that we don't do this again. Mm-hmm. I think our prognosis is positive, but not locked. What I mean by that is that in order to get there, it's going to require a lot in the way of resources, although I can promise you that it will cost much less to end this pandemic than to pay for its duration. So it's money well spent. It's going to take a great deal of political will. And I think one of the steps taken by the president, to be followed on by the Secretary of State, and again by across U.S. government senior leadership, is that we've got to mobilize that political will. We've got some. We do not have enough political capital globally to really join forces and do that. We've made progress certainly since I started, since we last met with you, but that is the second variable. I think there are a couple of other variables here that inform the prognosis that have been referenced. I think the questions about hesitancy and about vaccine delivery are real. And I'm very pleased that our USAID and CDC and other teams are working hard on how do we ramp up delivery and make sure that vaccines actually become vaccinations, but conquering this hesitancy, and we've seen this in the United States as well, is going to be another variant. So the prognosis is positive, but we've got a tremendous amount of work to do to realize the potential and possible goal of ending this pandemic in 2022.
Yeah, the kind of core message of the President's Summit was that this is an achievable goal, and to lay out the targets that would be necessary to achieve it. And I think to Gail's point, we face a choice. We can end this pandemic, or we can control this pandemic in the next year, or we can let it run for several more. And I can tell you, it will be both cheaper and easier to control it in a year than to let it run for 3 or 4 more. The longer we let this run, the greater the risks. And we have seen, with the Delta variant emerged overseas at a time that it looked like things were on the return to normalcy here in the United States, and it really threw things off course. So we can't be fully secure at home until we have really extinguished this everywhere and gotten this under control everywhere. And the best way to do that is going to be by an aggressive campaign of global vaccination to just give this virus fewer and fewer chances to replicate. Every time it replicates, we roll the dice on a new variant emerging.
Thank you. Can you comment on what appears to be the gender sort of gap or diversity, that it seems like more men are getting vaccinated than women? Is that true?
I don't know if I have the statistics on that in front of me. We are, the vaccination rates in many low-income countries have just been so low overall that it's kind of hard to generalize at a population level, but I think we can follow up on what we have and provide you with more information on that.
I'd add 2 quick points on that, and I think we do need to provide more information. The first is that, yes, as in most cases, I think there is a gender disparity built into a lot of this, given the nature of employment. Women, many of them are caring for families and so on. There are a lot of governments that I think are trying to balance that. On the flip side, in most countries, a majority of healthcare workers are women, and they tend to be in most good vaccination programs at the front of the queue. One of the first things you want to do is vaccinate your healthcare workers. We can get you more data on that. I think the last broad point I would make on this is our conversations, and this is consistent with the question on governance from a congressman previous, is to work with governments to make sure that they've got equitable vaccine delivery programs, that they are not discriminating against any group, any gender, anything else. So we're trying to work on that, but we'll get you more info.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. I keep going into the dark.
Okay.
But thank you all for your good work. Thank you, and I yield back.
We see you, we hear you. And let me just say to members, we're gonna, if any member has an additional question, we'll do a 3-minute round at this point. Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I'm actually, usually it's me with the technical difficulty, so I'm glad it's Congresswoman Frankel this time and not me. By the way, I thought Congressman Wexton asked a very important question about, how do you deal with some very difficult areas? Let me refer to an area that's not quite as difficult, but that USAID frankly has done, I think, a remarkable job, and that's dealing with the, just this huge inflow of Venezuelans that have fled socialism in Venezuela and now are in Colombia. And so I know that USAID has done a lot of work there, but it'd be great if you can give me a bit of an update as to how the situation is there as far as being able to vaccinate that vulnerable population of Venezuelans that are in Colombia now. I want to make it clear that I was talking about Colombia. So how are we doing there, and how is the situation with those refugees who are Venezuelans who are in Colombia?
Sarah, do you want to handle that one?
Sure, I can start, and my colleague Leslie Zieman from the State Department may want to jump in as well. I think you're right to point out that there's been a very robust effort, frankly, led by the government of Colombia, to ensure that Venezuelans are part of the their national action plan for vaccination. And Colombia has shown just tremendous leadership with U.S. support both from USAID and the State Department to ensure that Venezuelans are both provided broader temporary protective status, the access to education and employment, and access to vaccines. But my colleague Leslie may want to jump in as well from the State Department's perspective.
Yeah, I would just add Colombia is certainly one of the better examples of including refugees and vulnerable populations in their national plans. And we're seeing some of the success to that is again, not only the vaccine and the COVID response and mitigation, but also the full response to secondary impacts. And the humanitarian response has also been coupled with support from the development banks to ensure that not only are we able to provide jobs and opportunities for the Venezuelan refugees, but for the broader host communities. So we do hold that up as a model while COVID rates continue to be high, and applaud the work of the Colombian government.
Well, and I thank USAID and others for the work that you're doing there. And obviously it helps when you have a partner that wants to be helpful and that has their act together. So, but again, as I started before, thanking all of you and others who work in these efforts, thank you for your efforts there. I yield back.
Thank you. Let's see, Ms. Wexton, I believe you're next, but I don't see you. And so therefore I will yield now 3 minutes to Ms. Frankel. Oh, here you are, excuse me, Ms. Wexton, you're back. 3 minutes.
Actually, Madam Chairwoman, I have to go, so I don't have any further questions. I'll yield to the next.
Thanks for your participation today. Okay, now I'll yield to Ms. Frankel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I pass. I yield back. I'll listen.
Well, listen, first of all, I think to our witnesses today, first of all, you've heard the questions and the very bipartisan level of interest in this, what we're talking about today. And I want to thank you again for your time and testimony. You really did give us a better understanding of the work being done around the world to address this pandemic and the enormous challenges that remains. We didn't have time actually this morning to talk about the U.S. contribution to the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria to support their COVID response mechanism. So perhaps at some point the State Department can send us, for the record, how these funds have been used and how it has complemented our U.S. bilateral programming. So I appreciate the very hard work of the people at the State Department and USAID to address the needs in difficult circumstances, and we look forward to our continuing partnership. You know you have a willing partner in this committee, and I hope that you continue to keep us apprised of both your progress and your needs, because this really is a matter of life and death, not only for people abroad, but for our own country and really, quite frankly, for the planet. So I just want to thank you. Mr. Diaz-Balart, do you have any closing remarks?
No further comments. I thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I yield back.
Thank you. So if members have questions they'd like to submit for the record, please submit them to the subcommittee within, I think it's within 7 days. So this concludes today's hearing. The Subcommittee on State, Foreign Operations, and Related Programs stands adjourned. And thank you to the staff.